The slideshow. T. Baker appears at the top right-hand corner of the slideshow. Slide, monitoring requirements.
Thank you, Chris. So we will jump right in. Thank you for that intro. So lucky to be hosted today by Marlisa and Chris. So I'm going to turn it over to Marlisa to get us started and review the monitoring requirements that are applicable to the ESG program.
Marlisa Grogan. Slide, monitoring requirements. A bullet point list.
Thanks, Chris and T. We are going to start things off by reviewing the regulations that are applicable to the ESG program. So the exciting stuff, where the requirements come from that hold ESG recipients responsible for monitoring their subrecipients. And these federal regulations are really explicit regarding your monitoring responsibilities as recipients. The applicable ESG regs to be familiar with are in the record keeping section, so 576.500, and the enforcement section, 576.501. The ESG record keeping section requires recipients to, and I quote, retain documentation of all monitoring and sanctions of subrecipients. And the enforcement section of the ESG regs states that, and I quote again, regardless of whether the services are provided by a contractor or subrecipient, the recipient is ultimately responsible for project level compliance across all activities and services provided. The process for project level compliance monitoring should be outlined in the recipient's ESG policies and procedures. So we're going to go over that in detail.
Slide, monitoring requirements part 200. A screenshot.
So the ESG regs are not the only place where ESG recipients are held responsible for monitoring their subs. The Uniform Administrative Requirements 2 CFR Part 200 is the other set of federal regs to be familiar with. In this slide, we've highlighted the monitoring requirement at 200.329. Recipients are responsible for managing and monitoring their subrecipients' performance in compliance with federal rules and regulations. As a recipient, you're also responsible for taking appropriate action when you identify performance and compliance issues.
Slide, part 200. A bullet point list.
So the other key requirement in Part 200 applies to pass-through entities, which would be an ESG recipient that subawards funds to a subrecipient. So here at 2 CFR 200.332E, this ultimately holds the recipient responsible for monitoring their sub's performance to make sure they're meeting the goals of the ESG program. Part 200 gets pretty specific about the areas you need to include in your monitoring: reviewing financial and performance reports, following up on corrective actions, issuing a management decision to your subs with a determination about whether a finding is resolved or sustained, including the deadlines for the corrective action to be completed, and ensuring that the findings are resolved.
Slide, OIG and HUD findings. A bullet point list.
So as many of you know, HUD and HUD's Inspector General have monitored a number of ESG recipients' ESG CV programs. We've included some common findings here, and we'll link to the OIG's report in the chat. Some of the findings have been inadequate or delayed subrecipient monitoring for ESG CV, a lack of ESG CV policies and procedures, subrecipient grant agreements, missing information required by Part 200, a lack of documentation, which is what HUD relies on to determine whether you've met ESG requirements. If it hasn't been written, then it hasn't happened, is a familiar saying that you all may have heard before. Recipients not ensuring that subrecipients' audit requirements were met, and delays in making payments to their subrecipients.
Slide, importance of subrecipients monitoring. A bullet point list.
So I am not going to pretend that monitoring isn't a lot of work. It really, really is. And HUD staff know this from personal experience. It takes a lot of time and staff capacity, but it's not just a requirement that you have to meet as an ESG recipient. It's also a really useful tool, and it helps you make sure that you have sufficient oversight over your subrecipients to reduce the risk of fraud, waste, and abuse. So are your subrecipients charging reasonable costs for eligible activities? Are they carrying out ESG funded activities with adequate control over their program and finances? Do they have sufficient capacity to carry out the ESG activity until completion or for future grants that you may want to offer? Your subrecipients are complying with federal laws and regs, as well as the terms and conditions that you as a recipient put in place for your subaward, and also to make sure that your subs are meeting the performance objectives that you set for them in your agreement, both on schedule and within budget.
Slide, continued. A numbered list.
So if you are not convinced yet, I have some more reasons why monitoring is really important. It's also a way that you as a recipient can support your subs by knowing what their problem areas are so that you can help fix them. And you can help resolve these problems by discussing them, finding solutions, providing technical assistance, ensuring that you're following up so that the non-compliance doesn't continue, and just making sure that you're meeting the monitoring requirements that are applicable to you as a subrecipient. And showing HUD that you met that requirement includes maintaining records, documenting what you've accomplished. This is the proof that HUD monitors are going to be looking for to show us that you met the requirements yourself. So for ESG specifically, you can approach monitoring on several different levels. There's the financial aspect that you can hone in on by reviewing project financial records to ensure compliance with the grant agreement, with match requirements, other contractual obligations that may be specific to your agreement that you put in place. Housing is another topic area by conducting housing unit inspections, reviewing program participant leases, among other housing related records. You could look at program participant client files to ensure that participant eligibility and services have been met and provided. And you can also monitor on project performance. So reviewing the CAPER, other performance of a project, and that can help you assess whether your subrecipients are progressing towards their project goals and COC program goals. So with that, I'm going to pause for a second and turn it over to T to see if we have any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Marlisa. So we do have one question, and we are answering questions in the chat as we go, and hopefully, we can just raise some up in these in-between sections between content. But the one question we want to answer out loud right now is, can you outline what findings or deficiencies that would require repayment of funds?
So you all have a lot of flexibility as recipients that in determining whether or not a repayment is required. Similarly, HUD has a lot of flexibility, and you want to take in a lot of specifics into account when you're making that decision. Is this like a repeat offense that you keep finding again and again and again? Is it something that you warned against? And your subrecipients aren't quite getting the message. You've tried policies and procedures or requiring changes to their approach to carrying out an activity. Maybe that hasn't worked, so it's an escalation then to require a repayment of funds. But you want to make sure that, number one, you're being consistent with your own policies and procedures and across subs, so that you're not requiring a repayment in one case and then switching your approach and your standards to another. That you're documenting that you're not making just sort of I don't know, like you want to make sure that you're talking and you get the background for the reasoning behind the non-compliance, which we will talk about in a bit. You also want to have a conversation with your program council, and your field office. Your HUD field office is a great resource for this because they have a lot of experience in making that kind of decision, whether to ask for repayment or using another corrective action. But ultimately, you want the non-compliance to be reversed, and what's gonna send them the message and change course the most effective way. Also taking into account that if a repayment of funds may cripple them financially, you may inadvertently be doing harm if there's another more appropriate corrective action that you can take. So I know I didn't answer that in super concrete terms, but there is a lot to consider. So definitely when considering what to do, be in touch with your CPD rep and or HUD rep at headquarters in the SNAP's office, and we'd be more than happy to share with you how we've handled situations like that in the past and help you come to a decision.
Thank you, Marlisa. And we will move on to the next section. As a reminder, we have Q&A at the end of this as well. So we're going to try to do, 1 to 2 questions in between sections, but we do have time at the end to answer questions. But thank you, Marlisa. We are now going to shift topics to monitoring policies and procedures. So this is how recipients can establish a consistent process for monitoring their subrecipients. And I will pass it back to Chris to get us started on that.
Thank you, T.
Chris Pitcher. Slide, basic process, a numbered list.
Here we have a step-by-step overview of the monitoring process, starting with a risk analysis, all the way through the follow-up that you'll need to do with your subrecipients to make sure that they're completing any corrective actions needed to resolve any findings that may occur during the monitoring process. How is this relevant to monitoring policy and procedures? Good question. You'll need to make sure that your policy and procedures are detailed enough to cover each of the steps in this process. The ESG regulations do not provide detail about how you operationalize the monitoring process. In developing your policy and procedures, take your available resources and staffing capacity into account while making sure that you're still effectively ensuring program compliance. We'll share some resources throughout this webinar that HUD staff use to monitor. And we're going to post a link in the chat to a subrecipient monitoring guide that was originally developed for the Community Development and Block Grant Program, or CDBG, that can be really useful for ESG recipients. Vielkas will drop that in the chat momentarily. We're going to go through each step together in more detail, explaining what is involved and how to document the process in your policies and procedures for monitoring.
Slide, ESG monitoring policies and procedures, a bullet point list.
Here are some key components of monitoring policy and procedures which relate back to the 7 steps of the monitoring process. The risk assessment process and template are leveraged to conduct a risk assessment of your subrecipients as a way of determining their technical assistance needs, how often to monitor them, and how to prioritize monitoring if you can't monitor all of your subrecipients annually. You can use the results of the risk assessment to develop your own monitoring strategy for the upcoming program year. This involves how to structure your monitoring. You decide which of your subrecipients are most likely to need your assistance and who will require in-depth monitoring. Determine which areas to monitor and how you will assign staff. Consider conducting more limited monitoring of your higher performing subrecipients. Keep in mind that even your most experienced and successful subrecipients may have the occasional monitoring finding. Periodic comprehensive monitoring of each of your subrecipients will help identify and address problems that may come up while reinforcing the importance of complying with federal regulation. The monitoring schedule is important in your monitoring policy and procedures and should specify when you expect to monitor each of your subrecipients, updated annually as your project for each program year. In thinking about the timing of your monitoring schedule, you can consider short and long-term factors. Short-term factors could include subrecipients undertaking a new program activity that will benefit from monitoring or technical assistance conducted early in the program year. This will give you a chance to identify issues early on before they become problems or would otherwise result in a finding if you wait to monitor towards the end of the program year. Conversely, you can plan to monitor subrecipients carrying out ESG activities that require a longer start time until later in the program year. Do not initiate monitoring before there is anything of substance to monitor. Monitoring is not just a one-time event. It's an ongoing process requiring continuous planning, implementation, communication, and follow-up for your subrecipients throughout the ESG program year. There are some effective ways to ensure staff are operationalizing policy and procedures consistently is to require that monitors use checklists to prepare for monitoring visits, consistent monitoring exhibits, and templates including notification letters, monitoring letters, entrance conference agendas, and consider other frequently used materials that you can standardize.
Slide, key risk analysis points, a list.
When creating a risk analysis process, and while you're completing the assessment, make sure that you and your staff are consistently applying the process, that you clearly document the results, and that you have a defensible explanation for all of your decisions. This forms the basis of your monitoring strategy.
Slide, risk analysis rating examples. A numbered list.
You have options for how to structure a risk analysis and the method for rating subrecipients. Having a rating methodology is an essential way of comparing multiple subrecipients' risk of noncompliance, which can help you prioritize who gets monitored, how often, and to what extent. Two common approaches to rating are rating by score. So, for example, having assessment questions weighted differently, adding up to a 100-point scale. Well, another rating methodology is to rate by risk, defining low, medium, and high using, again, standard specific criteria. Marlise is going to jump in now to talk a little bit about risk analysis process that HUD uses and then start reviewing the monitoring strategy. Marlisa?
Slide, HUD's risk analysis for ESG programs. A screenshot of a chart.
All right, thanks, Chris. Before we start talking about developing a monitoring strategy, though, I'd like to share a bit about HUD's risk analysis process, how HUD monitors assess ESG recipients risk, the level of monitoring we need to do to evaluate the potential for noncompliance and ineffective management of the program, and how we actually choose who will monitor each year. HUD publishes the risk analysis notice, so it's available to you to read and get a sense of how HUD measures your risk level. We're going to put a link to the most recent version in the chat. And this is really HUD's blueprint for how we assess risk and come up with our monitoring strategy. So the first part of the notice you'll see outlines HUD's methodology, how we put the methodology into practice. And there are two key steps here. One is to evaluate each recipient to give them a rating or a risk analysis score. And then second, ranking each recipient to assist with deciding who's selected for monitoring that particular year. So the notice includes risk analysis worksheets for each program, ESG included, and we give each recipient a risk score based on criteria related to your compliance with reporting requirements, how complex your programs are, which we measure by how many subrecipients you have, any past monitoring findings, how responsive you are to HUD's outreach, how large your award is, the dollar amount, if you've received any citizen complaints that we're aware of, and those are a few. But you can actually see the actual questions in the risk analysis notice. And then finally, the notice describes what HUD's monitoring strategy entails and how each field office will develop its strategy for monitoring grantees. So I strongly recommend you become familiar with this document because it not only informs you about how you're being assessed, but there's a lot of material that you can just pull from to establish your own risk analysis process, as well as other steps that you should cover in your monitoring policies and procedures.
Slide, monitoring strategy. A bullet point list.
Okay, so on to the monitoring strategy. So you want to complete a strategy in writing for each subrecipient that you're going to be monitoring. Use your analysis of the subrecipient risk to inform your strategy and use this as your process for planning the monitoring visit or the scope of a remote monitoring. You want to cover these areas. Identify the ESG program areas that you're going to focus on. Take into consideration the high-risk areas that you identified in your risk analysis when you make a decision about this. Determine what data or information you're going to ask your subrecipient to provide in advance, which is going to help you arrive to the monitoring visit more prepared. Include any names of any subrecipient staff members who you're going to need to consult with during the monitoring visit, and also identify your staff who are going to be conducting the monitoring, like ESG program staff, financial specialists, whether you're going to have a team of folks or whether you can only spare like one staff person.
Slide, continued. A numbered list.
In addition to those considerations, be specific about which staff person is going to cover each program area that you cover, and make sure that they're aware of what they're responsible for. Then, depending on how extensive the monitoring will be, determine the schedule for covering each area, like which exhibits you're going to cover each day. Or if you only have one day, maybe you're just going to cover one exhibit, and how long you want to dedicate to each. And then plan out your travel, the time that staff are going to need to dedicate to the monitoring. Think about how you're going to have to shift staff responsibilities if needed. And then make a decision about the actual exhibits that you're going to be using if you've developed separate ones by topic area, like financial versus programmatic, which is going to help you narrow down the areas that you're going to need to prepare for prior to the monitoring visit. So you want to make sure that you're really honing in on the specific areas that are going to be covered by the monitoring so that you can also hone in on the amount that you have to read and review and prepare in anticipation of the visit.
Slide, monitoring strategy tips, a bullet point list.
So ultimately, you want to use this process as an opportunity for you to identify the materials that you'd like to see in advance as part of your pre-monitoring prep and give your subs as much advance notice as possible. It's not, you're not meant to surprise people, but if you want to see materials such as documents, policies and procedures, anything submitted prior to the monitoring, really let them know, because then this is going to give you sufficient time to review them before the monitoring begins. And you also get a chance to accomplish two things by doing this in advance. It's going to save you time during the monitoring so that you don't have to cram in a bunch of reading while you're actually there. And it's going to give you a sense of how well organized your subrecipient is, whether they are taking a lot of time to find the documentation that you're asking for, or if they have it there at the ready.
Slide, continued, a bullet point list.
So when you are making these choices in developing your monitoring strategy, make sure that you have a reasonable justification for each. So for example, if you score a subrecipient as high risk for financial management when you run through your risk analysis worksheet, you're going to need a really good reason to not include that area in a monitoring visit. Or if you monitored a recipient last year, then have a reason documented if you are choosing to monitor them again when there are other subrecipients who haven't been monitored in a while. So make sure you're documenting everything. And also make sure that your process is internally consistent so that the risk analysis results flow into the monitoring strategy and the exhibits that you select for the review. So you shouldn't have radically different results depending on which staff person's completing the risk analysis and developing the monitoring strategy. The policies and procedures are there to help you as a monitor carry out the monitoring, but then also ensuring that there's consistency between monitors. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Chris, and he's going to start talking about the process of preparing for a monitoring visit.
Slide, monitoring visit preparations, a numbered list.
Thanks, Marlisa. And preparing for a monitoring visit is very critical. So monitoring can be challenging and stressful, but there are ways to make your experience manageable. The more you're able to prepare ahead of time, the less work you will have to do during the actual visit and the more organized you will be. Some of the ways to prepare are to refresh yourself on the ESG requirements, specifically to the areas in which you're evaluating. Understand your subrecipient. Get a sense of their leadership structure. Ask for an organizational chart. See how the different departments and staff interact. Plan out your monitoring visit, whether you'll do an on-site visit, determine which staff you will interview and when. We'll talk through each step of this, of the actual monitoring visit very shortly. Provide clarity about which areas you're going to focus on and how broad or narrow the scope of your review will be. How many case files do you plan to review? Will you do a comprehensive review of their financial management practices or focus on one or two elements like voucher processing or payroll? Set clear areas of responsibility for each team member, and finally, ask for the review materials ahead of time. For example, if a subrecipient, ask for a subrecipient's policies, procedures, written standards, maybe a code of conduct of policy, but there are many other things that are in writing you can review ahead of time.
Slide, monitoring exhibits, a bullet point list.
Monitoring checklists or exhibits are a great way to narrow your focus during a monitoring visit and take the guesswork out of evaluating a subrecipient's program. You have flexibility in developing your own exhibits, but key elements to include are an activity summary of the grant amount, dates, ESG activity or activities under review, the relevant regulations and laws that govern each of those activities, the standards that your subrecipient must adhere to, the documentation required for the monitoring, accounting systems that will satisfy the identified standards, the status of the project and any problems encountered, and actions your monitoring staff will take to determine compliance.
Slide, example, screenshots of exhibits.
Here you can see some snapshots of the monitoring exhibits that HUD developed. All of the ESG exhibits are in Chapter 28 of the CPT Monitoring Handbook, which will link to the chat momentarily. Although this chapter is designed for HUD staff when monitoring recipient compliance with the ESG program regulations, you can use this as a resource when monitoring subrecipients or developing your own checklists. We'll take a quick look at a full list of ESG exhibits on the next 2 slides.
Slide, CPD Monitoring Handbook, a bullet point list.
Chapter 28 includes separate exhibits to guide your review of ESG program participant eligibility. Recipient grant management, which includes how you as a recipient are complying with ESG requirements. Subrecipient grant management, including how well you are overseeing subrecipient compliance, including monitoring processes, and activity-specific requirements for the components of ESG of street outreach and emergency shelter.
Slide, continued, a bullet point list.
Chapter 28 also includes activity-specific requirements for the remaining 2 activities, rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention, and then broader topic areas including match requirements, financial management, procurement, equipment, and equipment disposition. One note of caution, unlike ESG CV exhibits, which HUD developed more recently, the Chapter 28 exhibits have older references to Part 84 and Part 85 instead of 200 CFR 200, 2 CFR 200. So just be aware of that when reviewing and using these for financial related exhibits.
Slide, guarantee your success, a numbered list.
Thanks, T. I mean, isn't this exciting? This is one of the most exciting topics that we could possibly be reviewing together. Monitoring. And now we are at the point where we're actually jumping into, if you want to envision yourself, jumping into the car and driving to your subrecipient's office or place of work where they're providing housing, or maybe you're getting ready to start conducting remote monitoring. We're about to actually go into the actual monitoring visit, but I just want to take one more opportunity to reinforce the importance of monitoring preparations, because you're probably going to be nervous going into it, but as you head into the visit, it's going to make a world of difference when you're able to depend on a thorough risk analysis, monitoring strategy, pre-monitoring review of the documents you asked for in advance. You're not going to have as much pressure on yourself to gather all that stuff from afresh if you've been able to take a look at a lot of this stuff ahead of time. So another way to set yourself up for success in that way is to be as detailed and clear as you can in your notification letter to the subrecipient, which I'm going to cover in a bit, but also free communication with them so they know what to expect as well.
Slide, set the tone, a bullet point list.
Okay, so setting the tone. You're heading into a monitoring visit and you want to set a positive tone and promote a collaborative instead of punitive mindset. So you want to keep in mind that monitoring is an opportunity to work with your subs to recognize their accomplishments. Also identify ways that they can overcome problems and improve their operations. And it's really important to remember that this experience can be stressful for your subrecipients. And we've all been there. They may act defensively as a result. When we get stressed out, we can be defensive. So keep in mind that the main objective of you monitoring is to help your subrecipients be the best that they can be, and use the most of Emergency Solutions Grants funding, which is there for a really important purpose to help people experiencing homelessness resolve their homeless status. So ask yourself, is the program purpose being accomplished? Are program participants receiving ESG assistance as intended? And are the ESG program requirements being met? And then finally, remember that your primary goal is to assist them in achieving program goals while ensuring that the ESG activities comply with federal rules and regs. So establish a process that avoids giving them the impression that the sole purpose of your monitoring program is to write them up for noncompliance. You don't want to give them the sense that you are just dying to find out where they went wrong and uncover a finding and issue as many findings as you can. If your subs feel that this is the focus, they're likely to become uncooperative, maybe even resentful, and a lot less forthcoming with where they are having weaknesses and where they really need your help. So the key takeaway here: provide positive feedback, acknowledge what they have done well. This is really key. Focus on how they can improve their performance, but then also create multiple opportunities for two-way communication so that you'll be able to both identify and resolve any miscommunication or misunderstandings. Maybe you're looking at a document and you're understanding it one way, but if you can discuss and try to get a better understanding and clarity, you might be able to correct a lot of miscommunication or misunderstanding of what you're assuming. And then assume that your view is not always correct and develop an appreciation of their perspectives. Ask a lot of questions, try to better understand the situation, and then encourage them to identify what technical support they need to improve their performance.
Slide 6 steps of monitoring, a numbered list.
So we're going to go through 6 steps to monitoring, starting with the notification letter you send to your sub. And you may have noticed that we included the notification letter as a pre-monitoring step earlier on in the presentation, but I've included it here again because it sets the clock and initiates the monitoring visit. You're going to set a date for the entrance conference in that letter, so you are on the clock for following your monitoring schedule once that letter goes out. So you send the formal notification letter, give them at least 2 weeks before the scheduled entrance conference, and in that letter, confirm the dates and the scope of your monitoring, describe the information that you want to review, give them a copy of the monitoring exhibits that you'll be using to help them prepare. So you're not going to be surprising them with what you're going to be reviewing, and they'll be able to help you give the files and the information that you're going to need, and they'll be ready to do that. Identify the staff members of your subrecipient organization that you're going to need to meet with. Specify the duration of the monitoring. Are you going to be there a day? Are you going to be there a week? Give them specific dates for how long and when you're going to be there. And then clarify if you're going to need office space, if you'd like to do site visits. Identify on your staff who's going to be participating. Then call or email your sub about a week before the scheduled entrance conference. Remind them. So you want to take as much surprise out of the process as you can. And then a good practice is to include a template for the notification letter in your policies and procedures so that each staff person is using that same letter with the same information from subrecipient to subrecipient. Entrance conference. Meet with your subrecipients directors and appropriate financial and program staff before you actually begin your monitoring. So have that entrance conference to get everybody on the same page, and use this opportunity to explain the purpose of the monitoring visit and your monitoring responsibilities. Reinforce the importance of complying with federal regulations, that you're not just doing this for fun, but that it's something that has to be done. And it's really important to make sure that the federal regulations that are applicable are being met across the board. Verify the programs and activities that you're going to review. Introduce the members of your monitoring team and explain their roles so that no one's wondering who that person is and what they're doing there. Ensure that everyone's on the same page about who's doing what on your team. Then set up or confirm a meeting or interview times with subrecipient staff or clients. So during that entrance conference, use a little bit of time to say, okay, I need to meet with the executive director. When are you available? And you can do some of that logistics during the entrance conference. You can also confirm or schedule any physical or virtual inspections of properties, program sites. Make sure that you're gaining access to the needed files or work areas that are part of your review, and then make sure you are scheduling or confirming the time and the location of your exit conference. And then documentation of your monitoring activity. So the more you document, the easier it's going to be for you to analyze the information you review, and then develop conclusions that are based on your meeting with the subrecipient, any in-house document review, and explain the basis for any findings that appear in your monitoring letter. So you're not going to remember everything. So the more that you can document, even if you're jotting down notes, it's going to help you in the long run. So keep a clear record of your monitoring activity, including the actions that you're taking during the monitoring, identifying the materials you review. Also document the conversations that you're having with subrecipient staff and record your observations. Being able to identify the sources of the information that you use to arrive at your monitoring conclusions is really important if your subrecipients dispute any of your findings. So you really need to be able to back up anything that you are stating in your monitoring exhibits or a finding with the actual information and documentation, like where you got that documentation, who said what. Documentation is really important. All right. So to continue with the 6 steps of monitoring, the exit conference. Meet with key representatives of your subrecipient during the exit conference once you finish monitoring at the end of your review. And during this time, you're going to present the tentative conclusions of your monitoring. So you're not going to have your monitoring report or the letter ready, but you want to give them a glimpse of what you found, and then also what they can expect in the monitoring letter. Encourage your subrecipient to include their executive director, members of their board of directors in the conversation. And this is a key step in monitoring because it's your chance to acknowledge their accomplishments, present the preliminary results of your observations. It's also a chance for you to make sure that you've got any additional or clarifying information from subrecipient staff. So if there's something that you found, you want to make sure that you can check and clarify any sort of confusing information or ambiguous information with the subrecipient, and the exit conference is a great time to do that if you haven't already done so during the visit. And the exit conference is also your chance for your subrecipients to correct any misconceptions or misunderstandings. So they'll have a chance to disagree and say, oh, well, actually, we did have a case file for client A. And then they can also report on actions being taken to correct any apparent deficiencies that you identified. It gives them a chance to follow up on anything if they're able to. Then, just as with the entrance conference, make sure that you're taking careful notes during the exit conference. Get the date, time, the meeting information, as well as who's attending, the titles of the attendees. Make sure you're documenting what you discussed. Record what you told your subs and whether they agreed or disagreed with your findings. And then confirm that both you and your subs are both on the same page with your findings, and then areas of agreement and disagreements. So you may not reach an agreement on something that you both disagree with, but at least you're documenting and you're clear about where the areas of agreement and disagreement are. Next, the monitoring letter. Keeping in mind that the main objective of monitoring is to assist your subs, make your letter as positive in tone as you can. So you're going to use that monitoring letter to recognize the areas where your subrecipients have performed well, acknowledge the significant improvement in past problem areas if you can compliment them on that, identify specific areas of non-compliance or deficiencies, which would be findings and concerns. Specify how to address identified findings of noncompliance. So make sure you include corrective actions, include specific recommendations for improving areas of concern, establish a deadline for your subs to respond to identified findings, and make sure that you are prompt in issuing the letter, because a lengthy delay in issuing a letter or the failure to follow up could cause your subs to conclude that their performance is satisfactory, and that if any failures or findings were found, that it's okay for them to keep going on as they had been. So it's really important that you don't delay issuing your monitoring letter, and making sure that they take immediate action to course correct on any deficiencies. Don't ask your subs to meet a standard that you, as a recipient, don't follow yourself.
Slide, on-site versus remote monitoring. A bullet point list.
Okay, so when you're doing a monitoring, you can do this informally, both on-site or remotely. And we have some pros and cons for both approaches on this slide. So you could do a site visit, observe staff in real time. If you go on site, and remote monitoring can also be a pro if you're trying to reduce travel time and costs. But there are also cons, like taking more time, adding complexity in accessing files and documents, setting up meetings remotely, and then making sure PII gets redacted. There's a risk there, and that can also be more demanding logistically if you do a remote.
Slide, conducting the monitoring. A bullet point list.
Okay, so getting into a little bit more detail about actually doing the monitoring visit, let your monitoring exhibit or checklist be your guide. So you evaluate, you communicate, you document your observations, but really follow each monitoring exhibit checklist question and let that be sort of your lead for how, like, what you're looking at, what documentation you're asking for. But there are also other important areas to include in your visit: interviews. Never rely solely on interviews. File reviews have to be a part of that, but interviews can be really helpful in better understanding the documentation you're looking at. File reviews, client interviews, and then site inspections can be really invaluable to see your program in action.
Slide, documents to review. A list.
So here we've listed some key documents that you can use to monitor: subrecipient invoices, HMIS data quality reports, client files, CAPER outcomes, procurement and contracting documents, subrecipient policies and procedures. And many of these can be requested ahead of time. So take that into consideration. What are you going to review ahead of time? What are you going to ask for while you're there in person? And then plan out your visit, taking that into consideration. If you could do some work ahead of time, reviewing things ahead of time, really take advantage of that.
Slide, sampling. A bullet point list.
So when it comes to client files and invoices especially, you're not going to be able to review everything unless you have a really small universe of clients or expenditures, or just a ton of time. So the way around that is to select a sample of files. And the CPD monitoring handbook is one way that you can inform your sampling methodology. It's up to you. You decide whether you want to take a random, non-random, statistically valid random samples. Just to give you a little bit of background, if you're not super familiar, but if you do a statistically valid random sample, that gives you the ability to generalize your results. So it just means that you want to be able to select enough files to give you confidence that your results are accurate. So if you have a subrecipient that served over 500 clients, you're going to need more than a sample size of 3. And that's like an exaggeration, but you need to ask, or you need to look at enough files for it to be generalizable. But otherwise, your conclusions for random or non-random samples, they're just limited to the selected sample. So you pick a certain number, largely informed by how many people you have and how much time you have. And then you can make a conclusion based on what you're finding. But make sure that whatever your sampling methodology, you're documenting the process that you followed and the sampling methods that you are using and prescribing for your staff in your policies and procedures.
Slide, the exhibits. A bullet point list and a numbered list.
All right, the monitoring exhibits. These are, again, the blueprint for your monitoring efforts. They're your working papers and they give you direction when you're actually developing the exhibits or maybe refining current exhibits that you have. Make sure you have your monitoring reviewer in mind to help them more easily determine findings for noncompliance. You want to take the guesswork out of it. So ensure the questions are really specific to particular requirements. Make sure that you're connecting it back to an ESG statute, an ESG regulation, your subrecipient grant agreement, and that you're actually citing that underneath the question in brackets so that you can directly connect it. Like, here is what our finding is, and this is what the subrecipient is actually complying with, or this is the regulation or the law that they're non-compliant with. Be consistent in how you phrase a response. So if you're asking a question, make sure that in all cases a no response constitutes a finding. That's going to just help keep everyone on the same page and can avoid a lot of confusion in the way people are reading the exhibit questions and answering them. Make sure that you're including instructions for your staff and do considerable amount of training so staff know how to administer the exhibits. And just remember that this is really important documentation because it's going to be the basis of any finding, and you can use it to support your sub's administrative record. So if there's continued noncompliance, or when progressive sanctions are warranted, you have this in your record to show why you're making the decisions that you're making.
Slide, exhibit best practices. A list.
All right, as a monitor, closely follow these. Don't go off script. Stick closely to the areas each question is asking you to evaluate. It's going to be really easy to go down a rabbit hole, but just make sure that you are looking at what the question is asking and you're only answering that question. And because otherwise a monitoring visit gets really long and you find that you're very short on time because there's a lot to look at. So you have to really be focused, and using the exhibits to do that is key. Some best practices are answering the exhibit questions clearly with specific information. You don't need really long narratives, but it's the clarity, accuracy, and quality that counts. Provide dollar amounts, dates, names, titles, document titles, page numbers, contract clauses. Get as specific as you can. And then hopefully your exhibits have text boxes where right there the monitor can answer and provide that detail right next to the question itself and the standard to apply. So the description should justify your conclusions, identify the source documentation, and then be really clear if you are sampling to identify the sample you're reviewing. And a good way to do this is like a table. Include a table in your exhibit, and then you can list all of the sample, however you're numbering them. Usually there's a case file number or other de-identifying information that you could use to track a document back to a sample. And the best response also includes the sample size out of the total universe, how you selected it, and those are some tips to help you get through the monitoring visit. I'm going to turn it over to you now, Chris, and you can take it from here.
Slide, components of a finding. A numbered list.
Thanks, Marlisa. Before we talk about the components of a finding, let's review what a finding actually is. A finding is a material deficiency in your subrecipient's operations or program performance with a violation of a statutory, regulatory, or program component. Here are the components you will need to include for each of the findings that you give to your subrecipients. First, the condition. What is the problem that was discovered? The criteria. What requirement was not met? Be specific by including the actual citations of those regulations, of those statutes, of those program requirements. The cause. Why did non-compliance occur? We'll review a root cause analysis shortly that can help us with this. The effect. What resulted from the problem or what could happen if the problem isn't remediated? And finally, the corrective action or actions. These are the actions that you're requiring your subrecipient to complete to resolve the deficiency. What standard did they fail to meet and the timeline required to complete the correction.
Slide, tips for properly making findings. A bullet point list.
We're going to talk more about how to identify the root cause of deficiencies, but first, here are some general tips for drafting clear, detailed findings. First, make sure you separate out each of the 5 elements. Using a template included in your policy and procedures is a good way to ensure this is done consistently by all staff. For each finding, use headers that separate out that condition, the criteria, the cause, the effect, and the corrective actions. Make sure that the condition contains a description of what happened and how it happened. For the criteria, always cite the controlling program requirement that was not met. This will be the program regulation. For example, the applicable citations under 24 CFR Part 576 or 2 CFR Part 200. Remember that lead-based paint and environmental reviews have separate regulatory citations. HUD exhibits are very helpful resources to pinpoint those questions and their sources and those citations. Remember to follow the money. Now we're going to circle back to determining what is the root cause of a deficiency.
Slide, root causes of a deficiency. 2 causes.
Why did the violation occur? Sometimes the cause is pretty obvious, but engaging in a root cause analysis will help you understand the why. Once you identify the why, you'll be better able to pinpoint effective corrective actions that will actually correct the problem. Almost all findings boil down to 1 or 2 problems or both: policy and process and staffing. For policy and process problems, either there is no policy or process, or the policy and process is inadequate, or the subrecipient has a policy and process, but it isn't being followed. For staffing, what needs to be improved? Is it training, additional supervisory oversight? Is it just staffing gap? Or is there a problem with the subrecipient's organizational structure that inhibits compliance?
Slide, getting to the root cause. A bullet point list.
Here are some causes that are not root causes. The staff was not always aware of the requirement and therefore did not comply. State procurement procedures were not followed. Performance reports were late, but the cause is unknown. There is a lack of adequate documentation, and we see that documentation really matters here. And requirements were not updated. These explanations answer the question of why, but don't dig deep enough to uncover what the underlying issue is and what is the source of the noncompliance. So how do you do that?
Slide, ways to identify the root cause. A bullet point list.
The answer is easy. Ask questions, and then ask questions. Keeping the policy and process versus the staffing framework in mind from the last slide, let's take the causes we used in the last slide to take a step further. So why? If the staff are not always aware of the requirement, why not? Who is responsible for ensuring that a particular requirement, like state procurement procedures, is met? How? How is that information provided to the subrecipient staff? What? Does the staff understand the requirement? What is your process for training staff on this requirement? Do you think the process for ensuring staff are properly trained generally works? If so, what happened in this case? Do you think the process needs to be revised, or do staff need to be trained or retrained?
Slide, tips for corrective actions to cure the deficiency. A list.
A corrective action plan should include a description of each finding of noncompliance along with the root cause. Clear and specific steps that subrecipients must take to address this root cause. This is how to build and strengthen subrecipient capacity, and that is really important for monitoring. So I'm going to say that again. This is how to build and strengthen subrecipient capacity. These steps include identifying actions to resolve the present issue, looking back at previous expenditures or activities for additional resolution. For example, if you saw in your review that client eligibility was improperly evaluated for the entire sample, you can have the subrecipient go back and check remaining client files. Also, looking forward to prevent recurrence of these issues. Ensure that corrective actions include milestones to measure the progress of your subrecipients, a timetable for completion for each corrective action, and a description of future monitoring to ensure implementation. This refers to how you, as the recipient, will follow up to ensure that noncompliance has been addressed. Discuss the corrective action plan with your subrecipients to determine their capacity to implement steps included in the plan.
Slide, corrective action. More tips. A list.
Ideally, it is helpful if the subrecipient proposes a solution or a set of solutions that you agree with. Never forget to follow through if the problem is a failure to have policies and the subrecipient says it will develop said policies. Then they need to tell you how such policies will be implemented. And if you want such policies submitted to you for review and approval, be very clear as to whether you want draft policies or final policies submitted.
Slide, avoid these approaches. A numbered list.
Before we wrap up on the findings section, I'm going to highlight a few approaches to avoid. These are things to avoid in your monitoring process. Failing to make a finding. If you review a sample and only find one or a small number of deficiencies that are identified, findings are neither optional nor based on quantity, even if you see a small dollar amount or believe the subrecipient acted in good faith. While you have no discretion to ignore or overlook noncompliance, you do have flexibility in how you choose to present a finding and in the development of the corrective actions. Remember, subrecipients are your partners, and you need them to be successful and compliant. If you're looking for additional guidance for how to approach this, you may want to consult the CPD Monitoring Handbook 6509.2, see Exhibit 2.2. Remember, if you identify noncompliance and you believe that the problem has already been corrected, you still write it up as a finding, but you state that the subrecipient has done and that no further corrective action is needed. In essence, you're opening and closing the finding at the same time. Again, remember to avoid developing a predetermined outcome corrective action where you essentially tell the recipient what to provide, such as asking the subrecipient to provide documentation showing that the beneficiaries met eligibility requirements versus asking the subrecipient to document whether the beneficiaries met the eligibility requirements.
Slide, continued.
Here are some more approaches to avoid. Avoid the edict sanction. This is where you state that the subrecipient did something wrong and it needs to be corrected. That's not helpful to subrecipients, nor will it be effective, nor will it lead to effective compliance. Also avoid asking for assurances or certifications. The subrecipient is already certified in its subrecipient grant agreement that it will comply with all applicable requirements. Determine what purpose it will serve to ask again. Consider having actual items for the subrecipient to take to resolve the noncompliance.
Slide, what are concerns? A bullet point list.
Concerns are different from findings, but still very important in the monitoring process, and findings are not the only way to pinpoint deficiencies you uncover during a formal monitoring. A concern is a weakness in your subrecipient's operations or performance, which may become a finding in the future if it's not addressed. These deficiencies in program performance are not based on statutory, regulatory, or program requirements. While these are optional for the reviewer to identify, it makes sense to acknowledge and recognize them, either to prevent a problem from turning into noncompliance or to provide sound management guidance to help the subrecipient run a better program. You will know if an item is a concern if you ask yourself, would there be noncompliance if the subrecipient took no action? If the answer is no, that's a concern, not a finding.
Slide, what is required for a concern? A numbered list.
If you choose to write up a concern, it must contain the following. The condition. Describe what was wrong or what the problem was. The cause. Describe why the condition occurred. Again, use your root cause analysis. The effect. What happened or potentially could happen because of this condition. You have the option to recommend corrective actions or a written response from your subrecipients regarding any concern noted in your monitoring letter. And it is a good idea because it can help the subrecipient. Strive for recommending actions that the subrecipient can take to address the concern based on sound management principles or other guidelines. Include specific recommendations for improvement for each of the concerns you identify in your monitoring letter. I'm going to turn it back to Marlisa.
Slide, monitoring letter / report, communicating, a bullet point list.
Hey everyone, and thanks, Chris. Chris just mentioned including corrective actions in the monitoring letter. So in short, the monitoring letter or report, either is used, it's how you're going to communicate the results of the monitoring, all the findings, concerns, as well as promising practices to your subrecipient. When your sub receives the monitoring letter, they should not be surprised. And one reason is the exit conference. So ensure that before you wrap up your monitoring visit, remember that you're meeting with the key representatives of the subrecipient organization to present the tentative conclusions of your monitoring. This doesn't mean that you can't issue a finding if you didn't mention it during the exit conference, but then later uncovered something. If there's any sort of remaining documentation that you need to follow up on or that you're waiting for, you're not locked into not issuing a finding. But you want to be able to share as much as you can during that monitoring exhibit. You may have also gained clarity during that conference, so make sure that you're reflecting that in the monitoring letter. The monitoring letter, this is a step in the overall monitoring process that you should cover in details in your policies and procedures. Everything from how much time you have to send the completed letter to the subrecipient. One example of a time frame is 60 days from the exit conference, to a template that the staff can use to standardize the content and the formatting.
Slide, continued, a numbered list.
So for most of you, or some of you, you may already be familiar with elements that HUD typically includes in the monitoring reports that, that HUD issues to you. So you can use that as a starting point. Then feel free to adapt it as necessary. But you'll note in any monitoring reports that you've received, or if it's new to you, make sure that when you're developing a monitoring letter, you're taking into consideration including the program, project, or the entity monitored, the dates of the monitoring visit, so the beginning and the ending, the names and the titles of subrecipient staff who are interviewed, the names and titles of recipient staff who are conducting the monitoring, the program areas that you reviewed, which should match what was in the notification letter, explaining any deviations from the notification letter if you changed course and switched an exhibit, for example, and then monitoring conclusions, positive, negative, make sure that that's supportable, defensible, and then adequately documented.
Slide, HUD monitoring letter elements, continued, a numbered list.
If applicable, that is, if you have made any findings or concerns, make sure that you're clearly labeling them as a finding or as a concern with all the required elements that Chris went over. So for a finding, one of the key bits of information is the applicable law or regulation or program policy, and then present the facts to support the finding. You should absolutely not have a finding included in your monitoring report if you don't have a corresponding statute or regulation or program policy that's connected with that noncompliance. If there are findings, make sure that the subrecipient has an opportunity to demonstrate within a specific time frame, like 30 days, that it did in fact comply with the requirements or that it disagrees with your conclusions. You want to give them the ability to respond or correct or clarify. Include response timeframes if needed, and then an offer of technical assistance if it's needed, or a description of the technical assistance that was provided already or during the monitoring visit.
Slide, more about the monitoring letter / report, a bullet point list.
So some other references of best practices while you're drafting your monitoring letter, make sure that you're able to trace information in the letter report back to the exhibits. And make sure that you don't have more detail in the letter or report than in your exhibits. Your exhibits are your working papers, and then the report is where you're summarizing those. Never include PII. then also make sure that your supervisors are able to review the report before it goes back to your sub. And their purpose is to do a quality check to make sure that the conclusions are defensible, supportable, properly documented, that the findings are accurate, and that findings and concerns are correctly presented. So that means that your supervisors are going to want to read each exhibit along with supporting documentation as well as the monitoring report. And then again, make sure that you're striving for balance in the tone of the letter. So be as positive as you can with any sort of real accomplishments or best practices that you've uncovered, in addition to the problems identified. So keep in mind the broad basic goal of monitoring that you have, which is to help the subrecipient operate a well-run program that is also compliant with ESG requirements and achieving results.
Slide, things to avoid, a bullet point list.
And before we wrap up, I want to make sure that you also have some tools in your back pocket to know what to avoid. Using the non-determinative language in your letter, like the subrecipient appears to be in compliance with applicable requirements. That does not say much of anything. So you want to be really definitive. You just monitored, you should know either the subrecipient was in compliance or you found that the recipient was not in compliance in X, Y, or Z case. So make a determination based on the information you reviewed at a certain point in time. You can't make sweeping conclusions, but you can make a conclusion based on the specific documentation that you reviewed. Make sure that you're not, make sure to avoid not properly following the protocols for forwarding monitoring results to other relevant departments of staff. Make sure that you are sharing your findings with financial or accounting department if you're program staff or vice versa, so everyone is in the know. And then not being internally consistent. So the risk analysis results should have that connection to the monitoring strategy and the notification letter, as well as the exhibits and the monitoring letter. They should all be consistent and flow from one to the other. And then making sure that you are explaining any deviations. So you're explaining why in the monitoring letter report, why you changed exhibits, if there's a discrepancy with the opening letter, or if you're changing your documentation, there's always a reason for that.
Slide, post-monitoring follow-up, a numbered list.
All right, so taking this to the post-monitoring. So the monitoring visit's done, you're subrecipient the mon letter. It is really tempting to think that your job is done. But the post-monitoring follow-up is actually when much of the hard work begins, especially for your subrecipient. And your role as the recipient is essential to make sure that your subrecipient is taking action and that they're following through on correcting the deficiencies. If you are not following through, the likelihood of your subrecipient following through and executing the corrective actions that you're requiring is diminished. So if you make findings that are looking for responses for your subrecipient, you need to be specific and reasonable in the time frame that you're issuing, and then also the actions that you're requiring them to take. So don't expect like something to happen in a really short time frame if it's a more extensive overhaul of policies and procedures, or making a lot of demands for the actions that they're able to take when you know that they're short-staffed. So really try to take into account their capacity or lack of capacity when you're establishing timeframes for them and actions to take, and then make sure that you are tracking the subrecipient to meet the deadlines. Be upfront with them, like, is this possible? If it's not possible, please tell me why. What is a feasible time frame within bounds, and then follow up in writing or by telephone if a deadline's passed and you haven't heard back. And then again, be sure to document all communication attempts.
Slide, continued.
So documenting the timeframes for responding to subrecipient submissions is also really important. Make sure that you're including that in your monitoring policies and procedures. So for example, if the subrecipient submits information to clear a finding, your policies and procedures could establish that you then have 15 working days to respond in writing within 30 calendar days, letting them know whether the response is acceptable or not. And make sure you're keeping these timeframes in mind if you're asking the subrecipient to submit a policy or procedure document for their review, because they can take more time than other corrective actions. So again, just try to be as reasonable as you can.
Slide, post-monitoring, a bullet point list.
Closing findings. This is a key part of the monitoring process, and it directly relates to your subrecipient oversight. The timeframes for subrecipient responses to clear findings should rarely extend beyond a year, unless you have an agreed upon repayment plan or if the finding is contested. Those are situations where it could take longer. If the finding is open beyond the time frame that you set in your monitoring letter, the subrecipient may be unable, unwilling, or unclear about how to implement the corrective actions. So please keep your attention on the time frame and then following up on that.
Slide, continued, a bullet point list.
Then finally, consider the monitoring resolution process complete when the subrecipient completes actions that correct the identified deficiency, produce improvements, or demonstrate the findings and recommendations don't require management action. So you're looking for that resolution, being able to close findings, resolve corrective actions, and these are really the three criteria you want to pay attention to when you are making that management decision about whether they've complied with the requirements that you've issued to clear a finding or concern.